Just before I kick off, it'd be good just to sort of give you a bit of context as to why we're looking at this subject. Last year we ran what became the world's largest open foresight program, by which we mean we talked to 1,500 organizations, 25 different countries, and got everybody really to share their views of the big issues for the next 10 years. So everything from energy to food to digital to transport, etc. So all the companies who you interact with, I'm sure, on a regular basis, everybody shared their views for the next 10 years, and we put them into a big pot, and everybody's now got access to them. And the sort of 50 big things that came out of that lots of organizations are now using. If you take a step back from that and say, okay, well, what are the big issues that really sort of seem to be impacting lots of different things? There was three things which sort of came to the surface. There was the whole issue around trust. That's really changing quite significantly in who we trust and what we trust. There's clearly the speed at which the world is shifting east, and that's happening far quicker than lots of people expected. And then the other thing really was just the sheer impact that cities are now having. And the question you could say, well, what's so special about this? You know, we've always had cities, we've always had people moving into cities. What I really just want to do in these sort of the next 10 minutes or so is just to share with you a couple of insights from that program that sort of maybe reinforce as to why now so many organizations, so many countries are starting to take cities more seriously, and are starting, particularly in terms of your competitors, are starting to design products and services specifically for cities and specifically for the urban environment. So the first thing to say is, clearly, you know, last year over half of us were living in cities. By 2020, it'll be nearly 75% of us. The first question to ask is, well, what sort of cities will they be? Will they be like LA? Will it be New York? What's the nature? And if you look at the cities that are being built now in China, the cities that are being designed in different parts of the world, the general trend is to more compact, dense cities. So if you want to think of this as not necessarily sort of the skyscrapers, Manhattan type perspective, but think of places like Hong Kong at one extreme, and think of places like Paris. Paris is actually almost the perfect city in terms of efficiency and amount of people. Everything's about 6, 7 stories high, but there's lots of open spaces. It's a really lovely place to be. And there's several drivers behind this. One is clearly lack of land, so people needing to get closer together. But the other one is just about efficiency. And one of the conversations we had with one of the oil companies, they'd done quite a lot of analysis, and they said that if you take Hong Kong, round about 5% of Hong Kong's GDP gets spent on moving stuff around, whether that's people or goods. Around about 5% of the economy of Hong Kong goes on moving stuff. If you look at LA, it's about 25% of the GDP. And you just say, well, hold on, if from a logical perspective, which is more efficient? It's no question. So everybody's heading that way, and it has some serious implications because it means not only have you got bigger challenges in making things work in that denser environment, but it also has greater opportunities in the way that you can interact with people. So think Paris, think Hong Kong, don't think Mexico City, Houston. That's the sort of cities that we're going to be dealing with in the future. The reason why those cities are becoming really important on one level is just the sheer volume of people moving into those cities. So some of the numbers on the screen there in front of you, 42 people an hour, every hour of every day moving into Mumbai, 58 into Lagos. It's a non-stop movement. And it's quite clear as to why people are doing that. The aspiration of a better life, and that cities are really where everything's happening, and that means everybody wants to go there. But the challenge is that most of those cities that people are going into aren't actually ready to accommodate them. So you start to get some interesting challenges coming to the fore. At the same time, you're starting to see cities competing with each other for talent. Cities are basically where most innovation happens. If you look at all the innovation that takes place in the world, around about 80% takes place in cities. Around about 75% of the world's GDP comes out of cities. That's where the action is. That's where the interesting stuff happens. And largely that's because that's where the challenges are. That's where the need for innovation is greatest, and that's therefore why people go there. But you also have an interesting perspective, and you can see this right now in India with Mumbai and Hyderabad and Bangalore competing for the best talent. So you're actually getting the cities starting to not just be sources of innovation and growth, but actually starting to try and get one up on each other in terms of getting the best people, the best companies, the best activities going ahead. Another thing about cities is that when something works in one city, it tends to move very quickly to another one. Now, obviously, the photograph there is of the French Parisian bicycle rental scheme, which has moved from France to London to Marrakesh to Amsterdam to Istanbul. It works, and therefore it quickly moves. It's just the same as no smoking moving from city to city. It's just the same as congestion charge, and it will be just the same as fat tax when they introduce it. It'll go city to city. It'll go city to city far quicker than it'll go country to country. And the reason is that in many ways, there's more to connect people in different cities than there are in different countries. If you take Mumbai, New York, and Shanghai, actually the experience of living in those cities and the type of people who do live in those cities probably have more in common than, for example, somebody in New York and somebody in Idaho. That national element is increasingly becoming less important than the international city perspective. So this is just a chart of the big cities that are going to be there by 2020. And you can see, somebody mentioned, Fabian mentioned cities of 5 million. There's going to be loads and loads of those, but there's going to be 20 cities over 10 million people. The interesting thing here, if you take a step back, is the combination of the city-to-city transfer and the element that cities are where the challenges are. Lots of people are starting to say, don't look at the G20, start to look at the C40. So the G20, the 20 governments of the world who get together and try and occasionally fail to solve things like climate change and stuff like that. Actually, people say, no, look at the C40, look at the mayors of the 40 largest cities, because they're the ones who are really making stuff happen. They get together every 6 months and swap experiences, see what's worked and what hasn't worked. And it's interesting because mayors are in a unique position. First of all, they generally are getting more and more power, and more specifically, their community has a common set of needs, so they don't have to, whereas federal politicians have to address everybody's needs, mayors tend to have quite a bespoke set of audience, effectively, to focus on. And thirdly, a lot of them want to make a mark. If you talk to the mayor of Shanghai, and he's behaving in a very similar way to the mayor of London and the mayor of Istanbul. They want to do stuff, and they can do stuff. So lots of people, and whether it's the Clinton Climate Change Initiative or the UN, they're starting to say, let's work with the mayors, let's work with the cities, because that's where change can happen quicker than it can happen at a country-to-country level. Now, the photograph of the people moving into the cities clearly tees up a big challenge. It's easy, standing in New York, you've got a perfectly planned city, and most European cities are actually shrinking because Europe's population is declining. Ignore that as your data. The reality of the majority of the world is cities growing really quickly, lots of people moving into them, and we're getting more and more unplanned cities. The UN's view is around about a third of the world's population already lives in slums. Go forward 10 years, we're going to be around about 50% of urban populations are living in the unplanned ghettos, the slums, the townships, however you want to describe it. The bits of cities that haven't yet been planned are where people are going to. These are parts of the cities where you'll get perfect mobile phone reception, but you may not get running water. Weird contradictions are starting to happen. So in terms of what are the priorities for people living in those parts of the cities, they're still going to be the same as moving into cities for the opportunistic perspective, but the means by which they're going to actually behave and access is going to be different. And the other thing is to think about the sort of the rich-poor gap in different cities is following different models. You've got places like Brazil and other parts of Latin America where the gap is extreme, and you start to get gated communities, you start to get different behaviours in place to almost keep those apart. And yet go to Mumbai and it's a complete contrast. You've got the slums and the high-class apartment blocks right next door to one another, because that's how it works. That's how Mumbai works. It needs that proximity of the rich and the poor and the dynamics that happen between it. So again, it's a big issue, the unplanned cities perspective, and there isn't a single answer. It isn't just outskirts and inner city. It's lots of different combinations in lots of different places. And going back to the comment about the cities of 5 million, it's easy to get excited about the megacities. Big numbers, big names, lots of stuff. Everything that I've just been talking about applies equally to the MIDI cities. They're just some of the MIDI city clusters that there are in China. MIDI city clusters have just as many people, but they're starting to emerge as quite powerful entities in themselves. They're starting to emerge, particularly if you take China, and they're spending $1 trillion on their high-speed railway program. That's the second biggest public works program in history. The previous biggest was when they built the highways here in the 1930s. That is allowing them to have networks of cities operating in a very efficient way. And therefore, when you're thinking about urban strategy and you're thinking about what you're going to develop for where, don't just think Shanghai, Mumbai, think of clusters at the same time, because that's really significant. And then the last thing to say was really about, so what are companies doing about this? Are people just saying, okay, yeah, city's important, let's keep doing the same as we've always done, but dial up activity on cities? Or is there something that is different? Now, the photograph there is obviously of Metro newspaper, which started in Stockholm and then went and became effectively an urban newspaper all over the world. Interesting business model. Some people like it, some people don't, but it worked. It was a product that only was available in cities. And lots of organizations are now starting to launch products that are only for urban markets. In the food sector, in the FMCG sector, some of your competitors are about to launch products which only will be available in cities and specifically address the needs of people in those urban environments. That presents some quite significant challenges, because your old view of it being a country P&L starts to be turned upside down. You say, well, why don't we just have an urban P&L and the same products go across the world to cities, and that's separate from the rest of your product suite. So the three questions, and as you go through the rest of today, I'm sure lots of other people will be giving you different inspirations, but the three questions that really stick in mind for me, first of all, is how is this, what is a definite shift? It's not just more of the same, it's a definite flip to urban areas being in control. How's that going to influence your global strategy? How's it going to influence your supply chain perspectives? Going to that unplanned part, how on earth are you going to access that 50% of the urban population who aren't on the grid, aren't part of the established network? How are you going to access them in terms of advertising, marketing, but also how are you going to access them in terms of distribution, etc.? And then thirdly, what are the unique products that you haven't yet come up with that will really hit the sweet spots of the common needs of people in different cities? Because as the next speaker will talk about, they are really quite distinct, different needs, and you really need to get a handle on what those are and what they mean across all your different brands. So hopefully that's a useful just sort of starting point. It's meant to be a big picture, and I'm sure as we go forward, we'll be looking at things in more detail. Thanks.